The next 10-minute planner for my edexcel certificate students this summer is again based on the January 2014 paper. So it's a question that you won't receive this summer, I think we can say with some confidence. But it's also a question which, if you look at it and think about it, will A, help you address any question of this type, and B, give you plenty of additional information about several of the other characters who interact with Gerald during the play. So the question contained a quotation, "You ought to like this port, Gerald," and a question, "How does Priestley present the character of Gerald as an upper-class young man in this play?" And as with any other essay, the first thing we have to do is look carefully at the question and work out how to address this and what it is that the examiners are seeking. So, obviously, the question is framed by a quotation. You need to use that quotation. I hope you all recognize it. And of course, it's said by Burling in the first act when he's trying to impress Gerald at the party to celebrate the engagement. After the quotation, which we'll look at in a moment, the focus of the question is on class. And we notice that it's a "how does Priestley," so we know it's a writer's craft question. And so we are being asked to engage with what it is that Priestley is trying to achieve when he creates Gerald in the way that he does as an upper-class young man. So, with that in mind, hopefully this will take no longer than about 10 minutes, otherwise I'll run out of recording, but also it's aimed that this is the sort of length of time that you might spend planning in an exam, and your mind might work in some ways along the same lines that mine does. So, we might find ourselves planning with 4 strands and possibly dividing how does he present Gerald in line with Gerald's appearance in the play. So we might have the opening scene, the relationship with Sheila, the relationship with Eva, and the closing scene. And it's one way that you could effectively divide up this question, I think. So in the opening scene, we may as well, at the beginning of our essay, establish general knowledge about it. We want to bring in the opening stage direction, the fact that he is described as well-bred. Also, not quite a dandy, a tricky little phrase, but something to do with a man who is simply just naturally elegant and well-dressed and carries himself well. We'll establish the knowledge that his parents are Sir George and Lady Croft, thus he is well-bred, he is upper class. It is a statement of fact. And what we can then do is hang off that, what he does, or what Priestley rather makes him do, to show his class. And we will also, in this opening section, just quickly acknowledge the fact that we understand what the party is for. That said, we might also look at the way Priestley presents Gerald, and indeed most of the men at the beginning of the play, by their clothing. White tie is the highest form of formal attire. You are going to be upper class, or, as in the case of the Burlings, aspirant upper class if you are wearing that sort of clothing. At this point, I think we move on to the quotation, and we establish 2 things in the port question. First of all, he has a taste for an expensive drink, and because he ought to like it, using the quotation, zooming in, we have to assume that he has taste and he is able to discriminate between brands and everything else. This is the same port his father buys. Burling is showing off and trying to impress his guest. Thus, we have to assume that his guest is of a higher social status to Burling. Sybil, who of course is also of a higher social status to Burling, we know that from the initial stage direction, actually is very aware of class and urges Burling not to mention the cook, for example, in front of guests. Again, Gerald is the reason that that interruption is made. Priestley, because of the way he's writing the play, will set certain expectations to do with class. He's established Gerald as high class, and with class comes a political outlook. He is going to be a capitalist, and we see that straight away with his total lack of sympathy for the strikers. Sacking them is the only thing you could do, and his empathy, therefore, with Burling at that time. He and Burling work as a pair. They tease Eric together. there is a sense that he and Burling are relaxed in each other's company, and that he is a man totally at ease in the higher levels of society. Now with Sheila, we see one or two different aspects. We see his wealth in the saga of the ring. Sheila is terribly excited. It's the one I wanted, she cries, and we certainly see his wealth, if not his class. One thing we do notice is that he isn't particularly excited by the ring, and maybe again this hints at the fact that the wedding is one to do with linking two families in terms of business, rather than necessarily anything to do with love. Throughout his relationship with Sheila in the first act, it's evident that he is seen as a great social catch. Again, this idea that he is of a higher class. Burling is keen to tell him in secret about his knighthood, while stressing that it is not fixed yet. Gerald is very polite, but again we see Burling, the social climber, aspiring to impress somebody of a higher class to himself. And I think it's worth bearing in mind, and we'll come back to it at the end at this point, that Priestley's portrayal of Gerald is actually quite kind, particularly when set against that of Arthur Burling, who comes across as an absolutely obnoxious social climber and, well, hard-headed man of business. There is something about Gerald that is rather more relaxed, rather more natural, and rather less unimpressive. However, his attitude to marital fidelity is interesting. Sheila criticises him for his absences, quote, last summer, and we notice here that Mrs. Burling is very quick to point out that women need to allow their men such freedoms. Now, again, this sense of letting men rather behave in the way they feel. Again, there's something here that is almost intangible, but is much more of the upper class view of life than of the working classes. In terms of his relationship with Eva, we see it again. He tells his story. Remember, originally he doesn't want to, but Sheila convinces him to do so, and he is quite straightforward, quite honest, quite honourable. He sees himself as a knight in shining armour riding to the rescue, although he's deeply scathing of those dough-faced women, the prostitutes that haunt the bar of the theatre. It's also fairly obvious that he's a man with not only wealth, but also a large amount of leisure time simply to be in the position that he's in at these points. However, he rescues Eva, takes her to the county, and here we see he makes the staff feed her. Again, only somebody with class and wealth is going to be able to walk into a hotel after hours and get the staff to do whatever he wants. We then notice at this point that he treats Eva with respect, unlike Eric. Don't get sidetracked into the Eric question here. You might care to remember it if Eric is the subject of this summer's exams. But unlike Eric, he has the natural breeding that means he treats her with respect. It doesn't mean to say that he doesn't then go on to have her as a kept woman, very typical of upper class behaviour at the turn of the century. This is the reason that Charlie Brunswick has lent him rooms in town. It's not in case he fancies, kipping a night in a different place. It's quite simply so that he can keep a woman away from his wife, or in this case his fiancée, and nobody needs to know about it. Again, the behaviour of the wealthy and of the upper class. However, he does treat Eva well. Gould will tell us that this was the happiest she was at any time of her life at this point, and he ensures that she has money when he leaves her. And again, this question of wealth comes in. Wealth and class do not always go hand in hand, but I think here we can use this. Eric has to resort to stealing. He does not have the same basic level of wealth as Gerald. Gerald is of altogether a higher level. Now in the closing scene, what do we see? Whilst he's not on the stage, he's allowed to leave, he asks a policeman, and probably with no ulterior motive apart from wanting to get back into Burling's good books. It's worth remembering that the marriage might be useful for his father just as it's useful for Burling, purely on a business level. However, having received the information about Gould, he immediately wants to work out how this can absolve him from any blame. He returns to the house and receives a hero's welcome when he tells his story. You can find all sorts of quotations in relation to that. And from here to the end of the play, he sides with the older, not the younger generation. Now, that young man is in the title of the essay, and it's probably worth pointing out at this point that there is this sense that the younger generation, the more impressionable, will transfer their allegiance to socialism. Gerald flirts with it, but comes back, because for Priestley to be upper class was to be capitalist, and capitalists need to be shown as untrustworthy on a moral level. The fact that Gerald shifts back puts him back into the immoral and self-centered Berlin camp, the camp of the upper class, the camp of the wealthy, the camp of the capitalists. He has a totally relaxed attitude to everything that's gone before and is able to just wipe it out of his mind without a hint of social conscience. Having got this far in the essay, you will want to sum it up. He starts as a witty, urbane young man who is obviously respected by the family for his birth. He allows himself to be persuaded to put class to one side by Sheila when he tells the truth towards the end of Act 1 and beginning of Act 2. The truth, however, is revealing. He has a very easy authority. He orders people around all over the place, and he also has great confidence within himself. Again, something that marks him out as being of the upper class. When he does discover the truth, he reverts to type, and Priestley is eager for us to recognise that capitalists will always put self before what is morally right, and since capitalists are, or rather all upper class people are capitalists, it follows that Gerald is upper class, if you like. But Priestley is playing a slightly delicate game here. He can't upset the upper classes too much. After all, they are theatre goers. They also run the country. And the country is at war when this play is being written. He has to be slightly careful. What we're left with Gerald is a suggestion that being halfway in age between the younger and the older generation, he may change next time. When the phone call comes at the end of the play and the inspector will recall, Gerald might go over on that visit. The only people in this play who seem to be doomed are the social climbing Burlings. These seem to be the people that are really in Priestley's target. These in clear examples of social climbers, no social conscience, totally committed to self. Gerald shows all that, but is given a much kinder presentation by Priestley. It's quite hard to dislike Gerald Croft in the middle of this play. What I would urge everybody to recognise is that that sense in the middle of the play, when he's been honest, is, if you like, Gerald good. Dark Gerald is Gerald at the end of the play. The man who has gone back to the character that we saw at the very beginning, the character of an upper class, self-centred capitalist.